Thank you. Thank you, praise team. Thank you. So, we come to Mother's Day, and for some of us it comes as a blessing, and others it comes as a challenge, and I want to take a moment and kind of acknowledge that. There's a prayer that I want us to pray together before we go into the message. And if you look at how women became a part of God's creation, it is no doubt that it was something that God cared deeply about. The role of women in the world that we live in, certainly the roles of mothers. So let's just pray this prayer together. And if you're near a mom or somebody that's near you, don't do anything that makes anybody uncomfortable, but if you want to put a hand on a mom's shoulder or a lady, let's just be in prayer together. Can we put that up? I'm going to pray and you respond, okay? Mothers come in many different forms, and today we celebrate them all. Everyone here is either a son or a daughter. For those women who now rest and reign in eternity with God and whom we miss dearly here on earth. For every woman raising children right now. For the women who receive children through the gift of adoption and foster care. For those women who have experienced grief and loss. For all the women who deeply desired children of their own, but chose instead to extend motherly love to others. Amen. Let's just thank God for the mothers that are here right now. Yeah. So, and I don't want to take too much time, but I can tell you when we had our first, Dustin and I have 4 kids. After we had our first, we came to our first Mother's Day, and Kelsey's not even 1 year old yet, so I didn't, there was no car. And about 2/3 of the way through the day, Dustin said, you didn't get me a card or anything. And I said, well, you're not my mother. Can I just say that was the wrong answer? And that she's gotten gifts and cards every year since then, so there's a little wisdom for you. Don't wait till the kids start giving the gifts themselves. That's wrong. We've had an amazing week here. This past week was National Day of Prayer, and our church was one of the 3 places in Oviedo that you could honor National Day of Prayer. The Mary Martha Circle opened up and created a space in Lee Chapel for folks to come and gather for prayer. Yeah, this is an example. All of our ECC, all of our children's classes at our school, they all came and prayed. Now, with no prompting, teachers didn't tell them, hey, put your arms around each other and pray. Look at that. So we had, across the day, we had 225 people come into Lee Chapel to pray. We had 50 adults and we had 175 children lift up prayers. We also had representation at City Hall for the prayer time that they had there. And then we were part of a service at Grant Chapel, AME Church, at 7 o'clock in the evening. So thank you all for being a part of that. We are a church that's connected in so many ways. And actually, Pastor Patina's absence today is kind of an example of our connection. We have helped out Mims Methodist Church is over on the coast, and the pastor there, Charlie Watts, I've known Charlie for over 20 years, and Pastor Patina's gotten to know him over time, and we're colleagues in ministry. Damien has gone over multiple times and helped them with their audio visuals, their live streams, so that's what it means to be denominationally connected as a church. So a few weeks ago, Charlie let us know that he was graduating from seminary. He's got his master's degree. He's been working on it for a long, long time. It is huge that he has done that. And he wanted to be in Kentucky for his graduation ceremony. And so he reached out and said, hey, does anybody have an extra pastor they're not using? And Pastor Patino was like, hey, I got this. So she's preaching both services today in MIMS, so she's working hard. And I need to share one other thing with you. You know, about a year and a half ago, I began to have a conversation, Pastor Patina did as well, with Mark Tillman, and you all know Mark, took off and headed to Zambia and started a whole mission ministry over there. And we are so blessed this morning. Where is Mark? Mark's back with us this morning. Mark, hey. And I don't know the whole story, but evidently, if you want to meet a girl from Oviedo, Orlando, you have to go to Zambia. Mark fell in love in Zambia and got married, and they're back, his wife Jennifer, and so we're looking forward to hearing from him. But we are so blessed for everything that you've done, and to have you back here, what a huge blessing. So, yeah. I need to offer one more thanks. The Methodist Women in Mission put together this wonderful Mother's Day brunch yesterday. We had 75 or so ladies gathered in our fellowship hall, and it was just wonderful. So thank you for being the church that you are. If you remember last week, Pastor Patina offered us some wisdom in her message about how we ultimately gain control of our lives by surrendering control of our lives to God. And that helps us to enable God to begin to change our minds. And that's the whole series that we've been in. And one of the things that she said, she talked about how when we give ourselves over to our own nature, we have a tendency to do what she called edging God out, ego. And we do that naturally. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, because I want to talk about how we can push back against our nature and we can actually build a thought life with God's help that's transformed from our old thought life. So let me pray for us, and then we'll talk about that. As ever, God, when one of your servants stands to speak the loudest and the clearest to that servant. Amen. When you read the letters of Paul, it's interesting and important for you to understand the context, where it is when he's writing, what's going on in his life when he's writing this letter to these friends in faith. Because, well, when you think about it, the words that Paul writes, sometimes we picture, oh, these are beautiful words. He must be in some beautiful location. You know, the reality is, I'm going to share some words with you in just a few moments from the letter that he writes to the church at Philippi. And when he writes these beautiful words, he's not standing or sitting on a beach watching a sunrise or a sunset. He's not sitting in some study at a big desk with, all of his, materials around him. He's not sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the smell of baked bread, emanating through the air. When he writes what I'm about to share with you, he's got Roman soldiers standing around him, and he's in chains. His freedom has been taken from him, and so the physical surroundings from which Paul writes these words, they're lonely, they're desperate, and they're sad. And so you think, well, man, he's going to write some pretty anxious thoughts. He's going to write some pretty troubled words. And, if that's his surroundings, he's got every right to be negative. And yet, I want you to understand that Paul refuses to allow his natural thoughts to become the thoughts that stay with him. He could have complained. He could have spent his time. He could have wrote, my situation is awful. I don't feel like God loves me. I feel like even though I'm serving him, he's not responding to me. Listen to what Paul writes Philippians chapter 4, two verses, verses 8 and 9. It says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence," if there's any excellence, in other words, if you can look under the smallest rock and find the smallest thing and you go, "That's awesome, that's amazing," that's what I want you to focus on. This way, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Man, those are wonderful words. And I need to qualify, now that you've heard those words, I need you to understand that in order to live into what Paul has just shared with us, the only way to fully live out what Paul has offered us as this gift is to have that begin with a relationship with Jesus Christ. You will never work your way into these thoughts. You will never obedience your way into these thoughts. When you take a step and say, "You know what, I want Jesus to be in my life because I need him to be in my life," Paul makes it clear that that's a necessary step for us. Now, if you're sitting here this morning and you haven't made that decision, that's fine. You need to do that in your timing. But I'm going to tell you that whatever you take from this message cannot be all that it can be unless you allow that relationship to be the primary thing in your life. You can have better thoughts, but without a relationship with Jesus, you can't have God's thoughts. Those belong to that relationship. Verse 8 that I read you can only come into clear focus if you've made a decision about verse 9. Our lives cannot be lived disconnected from what our brain is filled up with. And we want to ask God to fill up our brains. Why do we want God to fill our brains instead of ourselves? Well, listen to some of these statistics. There are studies that tell us that our brains, our human brains, produce about 50,000 thoughts in a single day. If you're an average person, you have about 50,000 thoughts in a single day. And it's estimated that 75% of those 50 thoughts are negative. 37,500 negative things cross our minds each day. And that's where we usually begin our thinking. We take this amazing gift that God gives us that we call the human brain or the human mind, and 3/4 of what it produces on its own is negative. It's our natural default 3/4 of the time. Think about all the different spheres in your life: your family, your work, your friends, your neighbors, your hobbies, your profession. All of those different spheres of life are impacted in typically negative ways before they become positive. We allow our brain to wander. And we're told that when we allow our brain to wander, the research is that tends to be negative. So the crucially important question is not where we start in our thought life, but where do we end up in our thought life? You see, our brain tells us what it wants to think, rather than us telling our brain what we want it to think. And the Bible teaches us that our outlook on life can be changed. It can be transformed. Romans 12, be there. Transformed by the renewing of our minds. Paul had every reason to be negative. I want you to think about Paul's life. Listen to what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He writes this about his life. He says, "With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death, 5 times I received the hands of the Jews, the 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned." And just to be clear, that's in the biblical sense, okay? Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night, a day, I was adrift at sea. Is there anybody, does that sound like any of your lives right now? Anybody in here been adrift at sea recently? Anybody been beaten with rods? He goes on, he says, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. You know, if there's anybody that's got a right to be Eeyore in this life, it's Paul. You know, I tend to be that way. People go, oh, look at the clouds. I go, yeah, I think there's rain in those clouds somewhere. That's my natural default. I'm sure there's a tendency in Paul to be somebody that wants to say, you know, my life's not fair. Why do these things keep happening to me? But that's not the thought life that Paul chooses for himself. He chooses instead to move beyond the natural thoughts and to lock in on what is true and what is praiseworthy. You see, Paul had discovered in his journey of faith, in the midst of all the difficulties, this deeper spiritual truth about life, a truth that comes to him because of his relationship with Jesus. And this is the truth. If you don't take anything else with you, write this down. Remember, our thoughts don't have to be controlled by our circumstances. Our thoughts don't have to be controlled by our circumstances. And Paul didn't arrive at that truth just by pretending that everything was fine. He didn't hide the difficult stuff in his life and say, it's okay. He didn't walk around trying to put lipstick on pigs in his life. He said, I've got a really tough life. But that's not all I have. You see, what Paul had begun to tap into was to make his focus on what God was doing and what God could be doing rather than on what he was feeling. I'm going to focus on what God might be at work doing even in the midst of what I'm feeling. So how do we begin to do that in our own lives? How do we grab hold of what Paul manages to do with those 37,500 negative thoughts that come into his life each day? What are we supposed to do with that? How do we take control and build something better? Well, the first thing is that we start out by deciding that positive thoughts are better. That's a decision that you have to make, that you truly believe it's better to walk around with positive thoughts than to walk around with negative thoughts. Negative thoughts, they come into our brain naturally. I've kind of made the case for that. And negative thoughts have the ability to weigh us down. If it's about ourselves, it can give us poor self-image. If it's about other people, it can make us suspicious and doubtful. And the reality is that when we have negative thoughts about all kinds of things, whether it's work or job or families or spouse or neighbors or future or health or the utility company, when we have negative thoughts, it doesn't make our life better. Negative thoughts, if we allow them to come into our brain and continue to live there, they become loaded up with other things. Negative thoughts, when it comes to other people, make us suspicious and doubtful and angry. When it comes to ourselves, it makes us think that somehow God has made a mistake. He created all of this other amazing stuff, and he just didn't take enough time with me. I think that's why Paul challenged these early followers of Jesus to think about positive things. What kind of things? Paul says, well, here's a list. Whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's commendable. Think about those things. Now, Paul states it really simply, but don't believe for 1 minute that we can just think our way into that kind of life. God has that kind of life in mind for us, and that's why God says, I am the one that can help you have those kinds of thoughts. So you have to start with believing that positive is better when it comes to your thoughts. And the second thing is you have to believe that you can build better thoughts into your life. You can do this through the power of God. If you want to change your life, it starts with changing the way you think about what you think. Because our thoughts can either become boat anchors or they can become building blocks for the life we want. They can either keep us from getting to that life or they can help us build that life. Before changing our lives, we have to recognize that the mind is where that will start. If you're dealing with a habit, or even if you're dealing with an addiction, that begins to be broken first in your mind. If you want to correct or connect with your spouse in a way, if you want to grow your marriage in a way that you've not seen, it starts in your mind. You will only be able to behave better in relationships so much. If your mind is changed, all things are possible. If you want a breakthrough in how you communicate with your kids or your grandkids or that starts in your mind. Our thought life is the foundation of everything we do. Everything we do and say comes from the foundation that's laid down by our thoughts. Your being here today, the fact that you are sitting here today, you physically sitting in this service, think about it. It's Mother's Day. How many other places could you be? How many other places could you be besides, not just other churches, how many brunches, how many restaurants, how many, you could be at your parents' house, you could be all these other places, and yet you're here. That was set in motion by a thought. At some point, you thought, I'm going to church today, or I'm going to church this week, and here you are. So now that you're sitting here, and now that you're sitting here with your thoughts, I want you to think about your thoughts for a moment. What are things that you think about that you say, you know what, I wish I thought differently about this? I have these thoughts in my life, and I wish they were different than they are. Think about it. Is it an addiction? Is it a habit? Is it loneliness? Is it anxiety? Is it fear or anger or criticism or negativity or communication or relationship? Paul says that none of those things are fixed until our minds become focused on what's true. And his description of what is true comes from a deeper source than himself. He doesn't look around at his neighbors and go, wait, what truth do you have? Can I grab hold of that? What truth do I have that I can reinforce? He says, I'm going to go to God for truth. Paul says that truth comes from Jesus. And the truth that Paul focused on were these things that were honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. He says, think about these things, meditate on these things, focus on these things. Focus on the excellence that is worthy of your praise. Rather than thinking negative thoughts over and over about your family, your coworkers, your relationship, your children, your future, choose to find those kernels of excellence, positive thoughts. Rather than living with fearful thoughts about what has happened or what might happen, live positively and focus on the hope of what can happen. I want to tell you that if you're listening to me this morning and you're battling something, and you've got a doctor or you've got a medical diagnosis and you're working on it with a team of medical professionals or a psychologist or a counselor, if you're dealing with depression or anxiety, and there's a medication that has begun to help, make that part of your better thoughts, not instead of your better thoughts. And make sure that your better thoughts are reinforced by the fact that you found that doctor or you found that prescription. not telling you to do one or the other. I'm telling you those are both linked. Positively follow the advice of those people that God has placed in your life. But I also want you at the same time to truly examine the way you're living and decide for yourself, am I really the negative Nate or the Debbie Downer in every situation I find myself in? Because most people won't tell you with words. They'll just tell you by making themselves less available to you. I've been through that period in my life. I've been having a conversation with people and looked around going, why am I the only one still here? And it's not just because I'm standing on the stage. I mean, people found other places to be. And it's like, it's the way that I take the conversation. It's the way that I focus. I'm so guilty of this. And I'm also guilty of how I talk to other people sometimes about themselves, and I dress it up with things, well, you know what, I'm just trying to be honest with them. Really? Your honesty just left them in a puddle. Maybe you could find a better way to share your honesty. I had a lady in one of my churches years ago, one of my former churches, and she would say some of the most cutting things to people, just awful things. And she would end every one of those kinds of statements with, well, just bless their heart. Bless their heart. But you didn't have to be a mind reader to know that blessing their heart was not what she had in mind. You see, there's a problem with those thoughts, and that's just it. Those are just our thoughts. Our thoughts and our opinions about ourselves and about others, they can be wrong. I've had wrong opinions about myself. I've had wrong thoughts about others. You see, we have to be guided and led and directed by something beyond ourselves. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Listen to this. Do not lean on your own understanding. Now, it may not be true for you, but I got to tell you, Brian's understanding, my radar is just off sometimes. I like to think I've got it all figured out. I like to think that I know why people do what they do, but man, I've been wrong so often. I have to tell you about this circumstance. I was serving as an assistant pastor in a church in South Florida, second church I'd ever served at, and one of my roles as the assistant pastor, because it was in South Florida, we dealt with a lot of people that were homeless or in deeply troubled financial situations, and they would literally just line up at our church. And so one of my responsibilities was to talk with these people and get to know their situation and see if there was real help that we could offer. And so one day, I came back from an appointment. I was really busy, and so I hopped out of my car, and I'm hoofing it to the church office, and there's this guy sitting in the parking lot, and he is just dressed impeccably, a business suit, the whole 9 yards, and he's sitting in this classic luxury convertible. And he's looking through these papers, and I'm like, hey, business guy, look at that. Wonder why he's here at our church. And so I go in my office, and after a few minutes, the church administrator pokes her head in my door, and she says, hey, there's a guy out here looking for assistance. And the guy that she escorts in is the guy from the parking lot. Now, like I said, I've been doing this for a while, and I kind of thought I had a radar for people. And so in my head, what I immediately thought is, this guy's a successful business person. Probably got a good job, probably got cash. He's sitting in a classic convertible car. This guy doesn't need our help. He doesn't need anybody's help. And so before he could even tell me much more than his name, I told him, hey, we can't help you. I didn't give him any explanation. I just told him, we can't. It could have been we didn't have the funds or whatever. I just let it sit there. So having gotten almost nothing out but his name, he gets up and leaves my office. A little while later, one of the wonderful members of our church came by, a guy that was in my Sunday school class that I was teaching at the time. He said, hey, Did a guy come by earlier to see you? And he said his name, and I didn't even remember the guy's name. But the way he described him, I was like, oh, that was the guy that was here. And he gives me this thumbnail sketch of this guy's life. He said, I'm so glad you spent time with him, because the last 2.5 years of his life, he said he lost his wife in this horrific car accident, and he lost his business. He had a business partner that was doing all kinds of awful stuff that he didn't know about, and so he ended up having to, the business was lost, and he had to pay a bunch of restitution to people to get himself out of trouble, and he lost his home because he'd lost his business. And then his father passed away from Alzheimer's. His dad and he had had a really troubled relationship, so he hadn't had a lot to do with his dad, but his dad had been in a nursing home for years. And all he's got now is this classic convertible car. He didn't even know his dad owned it. It was in storage. And he found out after his dad passed that this was something his dad owned. But that car wasn't just what he was driving around in. It was what he was living in. And this church member said to me, he said, well, I convinced him if he came to see you that you would listen and that you would help if you could. Well, that's exactly what the man did. And that's exactly what I didn't do. You see, church, our thoughts, our assumptions, our suspicions, our conclusions about ourselves and about others, in so many situations, they can just be wrong. But when we gain control of our thoughts and we begin to turn those over to God and allow Him to fill us up with the patience to hear and see what is good and right and pure and excellent and worthy of praise, we discover that God can work with us and through us in ways that we never imagined. Can you imagine a world filled up with people who are allowing God to guide their thoughts? Paul can. After Paul told these believers to control their thought lives, he then began to point to himself. Look at verse 9. He says, what you've heard and received, learned and heard and received and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. You see, Paul was pointing out that he'd lived amongst them. He'd heard their stories, he'd listened, and he'd lived in such a way that they had heard and seen his story too. And he demonstrated to them repeatedly how to allow the Spirit of God to direct their thought life. I want to share with you one more passage of Scripture. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Paul's talking to the church at Corinth, and he talks about what prevents them from having their thought life transformed. And this is what he pushes back with, 2 Corinthians 10:5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Listen to the second part of this verse. And we take captive, say that with me, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. We capture our thoughts. Paul gives us 3 steps right there. The first thing we do is acknowledge that our thoughts are real. Negative thoughts are real. Then we capture them and we turn them over and ask God to help us replace them with His truth. So I want to invite you, the homework is on the back of your bulletin, down at the bottom. I want to challenge you. I know we've got to go to communion here. I want to challenge you to spend some time on those 3 steps this week, to do exactly what it says there, and to allow that to become a pattern for the way that you live your thought life. You know, Jesus, when the disciples gathered